what about Turkey particularly? Erdogan is still obviously leading the country and will be for the foreseeable future.
Turkey is quite clearly the key actor in this story. I think we need to be careful. I mean, there's sometimes a tendency for Greek Cypriots to play down, if you like, what we call the agency of the Turkish Cypriots. To say that they are just puppets of Turkey, seen as, the Turkish Cypriot leader who'd stood up and had protected the rights of the Turkish people of Cyprus.
What does this mean for countries that are divided about self-determination, sovereignty or territorial integrity in disputes, right? We've got, obviously, Israel-Palestine is another example. We've got Ukraine.
There's a disconnect between whether a settlement is good for Cyprus, reunification is good for Cyprus, and whether it's achievable.
This is The Global Gambit.
Cyprus, Turkey, the Med. It's a topic that is pretty niche in the world of international relations, of geopolitics. But it is very important because of what it means for self-determination, what it means for territories that are disputed. We can think of an example perhaps somewhere else in the world, or a couple of examples where that is happening. But there's one that happened 50 years ago. Just a few days ago, there was the 50th anniversary of what people in the West call the Turkish invasion of Cyprus. Since then, the country has remained divided. The island has remained divided, with the north relatively owned or seen at least by Turkey as the northern state of Turkey or Cyprus. I can't remember the exact name. We'll come to that with my guest in just a moment. But the south, also Cyprus, the Republic of Cyprus. So a country that is split by a UN buffer zone, and the only capital city in the world, Nicosia, that is split as well. I visited Cyprus a few times, and it's a beautiful country, but also eerily weird to visit a city that is literally a time capsule. But to talk about this in a greater context and to sort of give a bit more, I think, acknowledgement to this important anniversary is James Ker-Lindsay. I hope to say he is a friend of the show, as we've had him on to discuss the Balkans, where he is also an expert. But he actually lives in Cyprus, as far as I'm aware, and runs his own YouTube channel, where he does fantastic work on many areas of international relations, but equally is a research associate at the London School of Economics. And I highly encourage you to check out his very, very broad set of work and coverage and content. James, it's lovely to have you back on the Global Gambit.
Piotr, thank you very, very much for the kind invitation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So what's better, everybody listening, than two Brits talking about international politics? Quips aside, James, we have this anniversary, 1974. Obviously, people who don't follow international relations as avidly as we do may not have been aware of it. But could you give us a little bit of context, historical context, as to what happened and why this is so important, not just for the Cypriots and people who were affected, but for the world of international relations?
Well, I think the first starting point is that Cyprus has become, in many ways, the stereotypical intractable conflict in international relations. I mean, we're marking at the moment the 50th anniversary of the division of the island of the Turkish invasion. But in actual fact, I mean, this was a problem that had predated this date by at least a decade. The United Nations force, I mean, this is actually a year of 3/4 major anniversaries. So you've got the invasion that took place in 1974, but it's also the 60th anniversary of the establishment of the UN peacekeeping force here in Cyprus. So that was a decade before 1974. And it's also the 20th anniversary of the most significant UN effort to try to reunite Cyprus, which was the famous Annan Plan in 2004, tied in with another major anniversary, which took place a week after the failure of that plan, which was Cyprus joining the European Union. So this year is actually sort of quite a big, significant year for a number of different reasons. But essentially, I mean, to put it into a little bit of context, Cyprus had been part of the Ottoman Empire. It in 1878 was handed over to British rule, not British sovereignty. The Ottoman Empire insisted at the time that it remained part of the Ottoman Empire, but it was given to Britain for British rule because at that time they were finishing up on the Suez Canal. This was going to be the new route from Britain to Imperial India. And so Cyprus was seen as this really important way of protecting that route going into the Suez Canal, except for one problem. It had no deep water port. It was next to useless militarily, but Britain had it. It decided to control it. 1914 rolls around. Britain and the Ottoman Empire suddenly find themselves on opposing sides. Britain annexed it, and in 1925 made it a crown colony. So I know this is a little bit of the history, but it's worth putting it into, if you like, a bigger context, especially as some of this is now coming important again about Cyprus's location. 1950s come around, the Greek Cypriots rebel against British rule. They want to unite with Greece. Britain opposes this, Turkey opposes it. As the island sinks into much more conflict between the majority Greek Cypriots, who represent about 80% of the population, and the Turkish Cypriots, who represented about 20%, roughly speaking. There are three smaller communities, but essentially, if we think of it 80-20, and eventually Greece and Turkey come to the conclusion, look, the best way of dealing with this, we won't unite Cyprus with Greece, we won't partition it, which is what the Turkish Cypriots want. We'll make it an independent state. We'll introduce a power-sharing arrangement, and Britain, Greece and Turkey will become the guarantors of this new country, given a right of military intervention as well, which is incredibly important. The problem is it very soon breaks down. So we get to 1963, just 3 years into independence, fighting breaks out, the UN peacekeepers come in, the UN starts a mediation effort. That doesn't go anywhere. And over the course of the 1960s, what you're actually seeing is tensions arising. And that eventually blows up in 1974 when the Greek military government says, right, okay, enough of this. We're just going to overthrow the Cypriot government and we're going to annex Cyprus. And at that point, Turkey said, right, okay, this is unacceptable. It approached Britain to join it. Britain was, we can't really do this. So Turkey said, okay, under the Treaty of Guarantee, which had given it this power of military intervention, we're going to step in. And that's exactly what we saw on the 20th of July, 1974, Turkey invades Cyprus. So it's a very potted history, if you like, of what led up to it. But essentially what we were dealing with are these two communities, a constitutional system that broke down, and then eventually it led to this, what I think is the tragic division of the island, which the international community has now spent 60 years, 50 years since 1974, trying to find a solution. But as you can tell, with no luck so far.
Yeah, thank you very much for that very succinct but well portrayed, I think, synopsis of the situation. We're acknowledging the 50th anniversary, but you're right that events have gone back further than that, of course. And I am not unaware, audience, the fact that we have two Brits who are talking about this, and inevitably some of you are going to be like, well, that's rich. The Brits are talking about the sort of the acquisition of territory and breaking up of certain states and things like that. But ENIOS, which is the official term for the idea of a political union between Cyprus and Greece, is something that has been a bit, I think, omnipresent throughout this, and depending upon on the island where you go, and also for context, audience, I am primarily talking about the southern part of the island. You can go to the north. I have been to the north for a day, but there's a certain degree of tension, I think, depending upon, if you're a tourist and things like that, you mind your P's and Q's, basically, I think. But the south is, you go around different parts of the south, and there's different degrees of, I guess, pragmatism around the idea of ENIOS being achieved again, as well as the sort of whether or not people even want it anymore. A lot of Cypriots, I think, have gotten used to the idea of being a separate state. I think the British have called it the unsinkable aircraft carrier, although I think the Americans have also called Taiwan that. So it's a very strategically significant place. And of this, James, I welcome any thoughts you have on anything I just said about ENIOS particularly, but also the British presence here. We do have two military bases, which are intrinsically, ridiculously important for strategical value. They've been the hub for where the British have been flying and, should we say, conducting military airstrikes into Yemen during the Israeli-Hamas war. So I'd love your thoughts on one, ENIOS, if you've got any, and second, British, presence.
Yeah, I should have just said, correct, ENOSIS.
ENIOS. What did I say? ENIOS. Sorry, my bad.
ENOSIS,
Guys, it's been
don't worry about it. I mean, don't worry. But yeah, just so that somehow, just to correct it. lots of Greek words and Turkish words. So look, I think this idea of enosis or union between Cyprus and Greece, this is something that occasionally you'll hear Turkish Cypriots talk about. More often you'll hear mainland Turkish people talking about, the Greek Cypriots still want to unite with Greece. Nonsense. It's just simply not the case. This has been off the agenda since the 1960s. And in fact, yes, you can argue that the catalyst for the Turkish invasion in 1974 was that small group of Greek Cypriots who, by that point, after 14 years of independence, wanted to see Cyprus unite with Greece. But for the vast majority of Greek Cypriots, they became comfortable with the idea of an independent republic. It wasn't what they had originally wanted, but it gave them control over their own affairs. And I think, one of the things to bear in mind is that had Cyprus united with Greece, chances are that, yes, it might have got some arrangement for self-rule. More likely than not, it just would have become an outpost of Greece, a far-flung territory that probably wouldn't have had much influence over the metropolitan centre. I mean, this might be unpopular to some people, but I think, it's probably a statement of realistic fact as to what would have happened. And I think a lot of Greek Cypriots will realise that. That doesn't diminish the sense of relationship that Cyprus and the Greek Cypriots have with Greece. And of course, this is also very complicated. Different people feel a different relationship with Greece, and it can change according to context, is one of the things that I often point out. So, you put Greeks and Greek Cypriots into the same room. There may be certain areas where they agree on. There may be areas they disagree on. Greek Cypriots might be sort of very dismissive of mainland Greeks in one context, but if Greece is winning the football, they're all Greeks. So, I think we need to be a little bit careful about how we understand identity. It's obviously very complicated, but I think you would find that today, if there were to be a referendum, and nobody is proposing this, for union of Cyprus with Greece, the reality is that, I'd be very shocked if at most it were to get 10%. And I don't even think it's that. The reason I hesitate and say that is because, like in a lot of places in Europe at the moment, we have seen a resurgent far right in Cyprus. They won their first seat in the European Parliament. These are fiercely nationalist Greek Cypriot, Greek. So I think, maybe they would be more in favour of union with Greece. But I think really most of them probably understand that the current arrangement is better. So they can wave the Greek flag and sort of be super nationalist Greek, but knowing that Cyprus has its independence. So I think we need to be a little bit careful. And I often try and correct, especially as I say, Turks or outsiders who might have bought into that line, that this isn't the case. I think the other thing that's really also worth pointing out on this is that the relationship the two communities have with, if you like, the so-called motherlands. It used to be said that Athens decided and Nicosia followed. And after 1974, that shifted so that it was Nicosia decides, Athens follows. And I think that's very accurate. That Greece in many ways now is seen by many partners, European Union, NATO partners, as essentially a constructive element in this whole process of trying to find a settlement.
Right.
The relationship between Greek Cypriots and Greece is rather different from the relationship between Turkish Cypriots and Turkey. Turkey is still very influential over the Turkish Cypriots, and it's becoming even more so, especially as we've seen under the AKP government, under Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey. And one of the things that you hear from Turkish Cypriots, especially pro-Turkish, pro-settlement Turkish Cypriots, is that they're genuinely worried about the direction that the North is going in, that it's becoming much more, if you like, built in the image of Turkey. And they worry about this because the Turkish Cypriots, like the Greek Cypriots, they have their affiliations, they have their affinities to the mainlands, if you like, but they are rather different from the mainlands. The Turkish Cypriots rather different from a mainland Turk, same as the Greek Cypriots from a mainland Greek. And I think there's a real worry, especially in the north, in the Turkish Cypriot areas, that differentiation is gradually being worn down.
So Before we maybe come on to the peace negotiations that have been sort of pursued, particularly since 2017, I feel that they've maybe broken down, but things have certainly seen a regression since 2017 and sort of conceded efforts to do that. But what's your perspective on the UK in all of this? As I said about the British bases in the south, but also we now do have a new government since 2010. I'm not expecting there to be a sort of seismic shift in UK foreign policy across the board, but maybe on niche issues like Cyprus, could we see a more conciliatory tone from a Keir Starmer government on this, maybe trying to help facilitate conflict mediation or peace talks between the two, as well as the UN? Where do you see the UK in all this?
I mean, as you can imagine, there's a complex relationship. So Cyprus had been a British colony. The Greek Cypriots fought to end British rule. So I think what we see is that battle to end British rule has, if you like, entered the national mythology of state building. It's very much that this was a battle that was fought against the British and won. And I think while I understand that, and it's a very natural reaction, I've always felt that the problem that creates is a sense in certain quarters that battle continues. Now, one of the legacies of decolonization in Cyprus was, as you noted, that Britain retains 2 military bases on the island. And yes, this is a source of frustration, anger within parts of the Greek Cypriot community. I think, it's a little bit more complicated than that. And that has certainly changed in recent years for reasons I'll talk about. But essentially, there is a very complex relationship, as I say, of many Greek Cypriots still believing that somehow Britain is trying to get revenge for its defeat in the 1950s. Now, one of the things I point out that this was the era of decolonization. Britain was essentially divesting itself of about 50 different colonies. It doesn't harbor those sort of grudges. From the moment that Cyprus became independent, in actual fact, those bases became the focus of British foreign policy. And in order for those bases to function in Cyprus, it meant having a good relationship with the Republic of Cyprus, with the internationally recognized government. So in fact, actually what we've seen, and I know that a number of conspiratorially minded Greek Cypriots will be very, very upset at what I'm about to say. But as somebody who's worked on the archives, who's been through this, and it's backed up by Greek Cypriot researchers and other foreign researchers, is that the reality is that on, I think, almost every single occasion since 1960, when Britain has been forced to make a choice between the Republic of Cyprus, the Greek Cypriots, or Turkey, Britain has actually gone for the Republic. Turkey was important as a NATO ally. It was more important to the United States. For Britain, the bases have been more significant. And so in actual fact, it wanted to cultivate a good relationship. Now, as I say, Greek Cypriots will immediately say, but this is absolutely wrong. It's not true. Britain was always pro-Turkish Cypriot. 1963, the crisis broke out. Britain stepped in with a peacekeeping force. It supported UN Resolution 186 eventually. That established the UN peacekeeping force here. 1974, people would say, why didn't Britain intervene? Well, it was a complex time in the Cold War, but let's also remember that when the military coup took place and Archbishop Makarios, the president of Cyprus, the leader of the Greek Cypriots, his life was at risk. It was actually Britain who got him off the island via London to New York to address the Security Council. 1983, the Turkish Cypriots declare independence. For months, Britain had been warning the Turkish Cypriots, do not do this. If you do this, we will be forced to take action. The Turkish Cypriots press ahead with it. Britain drafts the UN Security Council resolution, which condemned the Declaration of Independence and is effectively the basis for Turkish Cypriot isolation now. So what we see is that while it's a good headline for many people to say that Britain and Cyprus have this tense relationship and, Greek Cypriots will say, we don't like Britain and all its policies. When you dig down a little deeper, there's a very different relationship that exists there. And I think one of the really big transformations that we've seen, especially I think since 2016, 2017, is a much healthier relationship that's developed between Britain and Cyprus. Notwithstanding Brexit, yes, that's complicated things, but I think the level of cooperation that we're seeing across the board is much, much better. And remembering there's a large British community here in Cyprus. We don't know exactly. Many Greek Cypriots have British passports, but it's probably felt that, of non-Greek Cypriot origin or non-Cypriot origin Brits, it's probably about 40,000 people out of a population of about a million. So it's about 4%. And of course, you've got a very large Cypriot, especially Greek Cypriot population in London. So there's all sorts of ties that exist between the country. And I think one of the best things that I've seen is that there is this much healthier relationship between Cyprus and Britain.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And I do think that the shall we say, the expat, the diaspora on both sides is quite fundamental in this relationship. We've mentioned Turkey in passing, but I do want to have your take. We've had a couple of Turkish guests on the show before, not really covered Cyprus as much, but what about Turkey particularly? Erdogan is still obviously leading the country and will be for the foreseeable future, but he's working with a slightly weaker position given the election last year, and generally I think people are trying to sort of... He's tried to centralize power. He's tried to, make a version of Hungary, or, pick up elements of, make it a liberal democracy, a hybrid regime, all these sorts of things. But, his power has actually been somewhat restrained a little bit in his efforts to sort of centralize power or politicize the judiciary or intimidate political opposition. So where do you see Turkey in this? And then we'll come a bit after that to this specific piece conversations.
I mean, Turkey is quite clearly the key actor in this story. I think we need to be careful. I mean, there's sometimes a tendency for Greek Cypriots to play down, if you like, what we call the agency of the Turkish Cypriots, to say that they are just puppets of Turkey. And it's always been a little bit more complicated than that, and one especially thinks back to the legendary Turkish Cypriot leader, Rauf Denktash, who was phenomenally hardline and next to impossible to engage in talks. And Turkey certainly didn't control him. If anything, it was the other way round. And there's all sorts of stories that what would actually happen is that the second he thought that Turkey was on the verge of even thinking about selling him out, he'd jump on a plane, he'd go straight onto the Turkish media, he'd give a talk at a Turkish university, and Turkish leaders would run in fear of him, because he was actually a hero in Turkey. He was seen as, the Turkish Cypriot leader who'd stood up and had protected the rights of the Turkish people of Cyprus. He was very much a particular character, and we've not had any leaders who've commanded that sort of control in Turkey since. But we have had a real sense that the Turkish Cypriots are, in their own way, their own people. They rely on Turkey in many ways financially, for military protection as they see it. But they do actually have their own political system and a much more vibrant degree of exchange, of political exchange, especially these days, in many ways than you see in Turkey. But there is this worry that certainly under Erdogan, and it's become more and more, that we've seen the extension of Turkish control over the north. And that has raised questions, especially as after the last leadership election in the north. I'm going to use that sort of the term that, people will use, the so-called president of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, Ersin Tatar. But essentially, it was revealed that Turkey had engineered it for him to take power. And I think that has really given a sense that Turkey is now pulling the strings in the north. And Turkey is sounding an exceptionally hardline tone at the moment on settlement efforts. It's not even pretending that it wants to see a resumption of talks on the internationally accepted parameters of a settlement, which is what we call a bizonal bicommunal federation. but is now talking quite openly about a two-state solution. And this is becoming a real source of frustration for many observers, for many who still remain committed to seeing a reunified Cyprus, because when you're talking about so openly division, that there is no room for talks, then, it creates a very, very different dynamic. And I think that this is something that, a lot of people are worried about, this change in tone from Turkey, as well as the Turkish Cypriot leadership at the moment.
Yeah, thank you for that, James. Very well put. And it leads me nicely into the sort of the main question, which is, well, it's a couple of questions in one, but it's all under the banner of where do we go from here? The prospect of peace and solution and mediation, those sorts of themes, right, audience? And as I said earlier on, since really 2017, negotiations around sort of, well, under the UN auspices to unify Cyprus, as you call it, a bizonal, bi-communal federation, have largely broken down. Prospects for renewed talks, from what I can remember, let alone a settlement, have basically receded as the geopolitical situation, and this is all prior. I mean, I mainly talk about it sort of about a year ago, so before Israel, Gaza, and Palestine all really developed. Right, the near abroad, shall we say, of Cyprus has really escalated to levels that we hoped would never, occur. So basically the sovereignty disputes are really embedded now, and we have seen talks appear on a periodical basis in Geneva, but they've never really amounted to much. And so, James, I want to ask you quite simply, maybe you've partially answered it in your previous response, but how much prospect is there for some kind of peaceful solution to this, be it a full-blown settlement, unified Cyprus, a two-state solution? And so that leads me neatly into my second affiliated question, which is, from a theoretical standpoint, what does this mean for countries that are divided about self-determination and sovereignty or territorial integrity in disputes, right? We've got, obviously, Israel, Palestine is another example. We've got Ukraine. But Cyprus is arguably one of the most pertinent examples of this. Where do you see it from that perspective?
Okay, so there's a lot there to unpack. I think on the question of settlement, I think there's a disconnect between whether a settlement is good for Cyprus, reunification is good for Cyprus, and whether it's achievable. Now, I absolutely believe that a settlement still remains in the best interest of the Cypriots. This is an unhealthy situation to see. You have a militarized dividing line between the two communities that in many ways their sense of difference from each other meant a lot more in the 1960s, when, frankly speaking, Cyprus was relatively impoverished and an agricultural society. And today, where you've got mass immigration on both sides of the Green Line, there is far more that brings together Greek and Turkish Cypriots as original inhabitants of this island than within their wider communities now. I mean, Cyprus, the Republic, so the area that's, to use the correct terminology, the area that's still under, the effective control of the government. So actually roughly around 1/5 of the population weren't born in Cyprus, which is actually one of the highest proportions, if not the highest proportion in the European Union. And I say that as one of those people. So in that sense, the division makes less and less sense as both societies become more pluralist anyway. The idea that, your average Greek Cypriot can rub along far better with Filipinos, Russians, Brits than they can with fellow Turkish Cypriots is just becomes more and more bizarre in many ways. So I definitely believe that it should be achievable. I think, as I say, that it's a very worrying situation that you have this militarized boundary that's not just a boundary between Greek and Turkish Cypriots, but is increasingly becoming a boundary between the European Union and Turkey. So I think the general sense is that for the broader security of the Eastern Mediterranean, and remembering that if you have a settlement, and I know this will be a controversial point to make, but it's becoming more and more embedded, I think certainly within Greek Cypriot society, that Cyprus could also potentially join NATO. And we're already seeing the importance of Cyprus as an outpost for the Middle East, for its humanitarian activity in the Middle East. But it would also become an important security base. And, you've got the bases here already. But I think, Cyprus is very much moving in that direction and can see itself as part of NATO. But while the island is divided, Turkey blocks that from happening. So I think from a broader strategic point of view, for the European Union, for NATO, a settlement remains actually a priority, that it will introduce a stability, an element of stability in the Eastern Mediterranean that I think we can all recognize is incredibly important. And that's on top of the benefits that will be felt on Ireland from getting rid of what is a very, very unnatural division. But of course, it's making it work. And this has been the problem, and that there is a growing sense, especially as we mark 60th anniversary of the creation of the UN peacekeeping force, we mark 50th anniversary of the invasion, 20th anniversary of Cyprus' accession to the European Union. Is this still possible? Is there a way that we can find a key to unlock this? And what we've seen recently is that the UN Secretary General appointed a personal envoy, a former foreign minister of Colombia, to come here to evaluate whether there's room for talks to begin again. And we don't know what her final report is, but she did write an open letter, which seems to suggest that she feels that the time is not ripe at the moment, that there isn't a political will. She hasn't identified where it lies. But remembering, of course, the Turkish Cypriots are now talking very openly about two-state solution, contrary to UN Security Council resolutions. So there's a real sense that, whether we can see a settlement, it's hard. And a lot of people are becoming, much more... Well, look, put it this way. I often say that prior to COVID, I would come to Cyprus and I would pick up a sense of despondency about the prospects of a solution. People didn't feel it could be done. I came back after COVID. I've come back to live here. I get a real sense of apathy now, that people have gone beyond the sense of it can't be done to I don't care, which is really worrying in all sorts of ways, especially for a younger generation to have those views. It matters for all the reasons that I've outlined. So I would like to think that somehow we can still find that key that's going to unlock it. But as many observers point out, with every passing year, it seems harder and harder to see how that's going to happen.
Well, on that perplexing note, James, Professor James Ker-Lindsay, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for joining the show again. This has been a bit of a whirlwind. I've always wanted to cover Cyprus in more depth because it's I've been there quite a few times and it's such a beautiful, beautiful island, but a very divided one, and potentially a sort of a continued political case study for academics, scholars, and nerds alike. But I don't think we should forget that we are playing sort of God sometimes, not us specifically, but people, how we're sort of picking up and being like, well, the line can go here and that sort of thing. So we say this all with a high degree of sensitivity and consciousness of the people who are there and stuck in the middle, or the lack of sort of choice for some people. But yeah, if you haven't already, do check out James's channel. James, I very much look forward to having you on again. Hopefully we can talk about something related to the Balkans, or, we have James on with the live streams. But this is the Global Gambit, everyone. We talk about issues at the nexus of geopolitical risk and global macro, and what it means for you, your money, your interests. And I'll see you all in the next one. But as always, wish you peace of mind. Take care.